Welcome. This is Glenn, and you're listening to Wild Earth Conversations on KWSI Radio in Grand Junction, Colorado. Wild Earth Conversations is about engaging thoughtful individuals in meaningful conversations that connects their interests and insights to the vision of a thriving and beautiful planet. Today's guest is William Lynn. He is the founder of Pan Works, an independent center for ethics and policy. He has written many academic and popular publications about wolf recovery, outdoor cats, biodiversity, rewilding, urban ecology, and so on. He has also given many keynote presentations on people, animals, and nature. Welcome, Bill, to part 2 of our interview. Let's pick up where we left off. I watched a podcast on PanWorks called Messaging in Wildlife Ballot Initiatives. Rebecca Nemick made the case.
Yes, Becky Nemick.
Okay. That Proposition 127, which would have stopped the trophy hunting of mountain lions and the unlimited trapping of bobcats, failed at the ballot box in the November 2025 Colorado election, not because people voted against carnivores, but because they felt this matter should be left to the experts, namely the scientists, biologists, and agency people who are already managing Colorado's wildlife. In other words, people voted in the majority for what they regarded was a science-based decision-making process instead of ballot box biology. Do you think that if environmentalists and animal advocates would have framed the issue as an ethical one, instead of emphasizing the biological role of mountain lions and bobcats in the ecosystem, then this ballot measure would have passed?
I don't know whether, well, let me say this. Framing takes time. It's not something you can get easy metrics on to measure, and the measure is really in the proof in the pudding. So the far right has been doing this kind of framing of issues for 50 years now through this network of organizations in which think tanks have a very big role, and has been able to capture American politics because of that, even though the far right represents a small slice of the American electorate. So whether just changing the messaging to focus on ethics or to undermine the unbiased expertise of state wildlife management, I don't know how fast that would work. And I'm sure, you really should talk to Becky Nemick about this, because she's the expert in this, and of course she did a really good job on our podcast. But I do think this is that whether or not ethics would have changed the vote, ethics should always be part of these campaigns, because fundamentally this is what the debate is about. It's about the values, and it's ethics that makes those values transparent and accountable, and also helps you envision where you want to go. So yes, ethics ought to be used, whether it changes that debate immediately or not. I think someone who's doing an excellent job in this regard is Francisco Santiago Avila, who is the Director of Science and Policy at Washington Wildlife First, an organization there that's formed a coalition of both conservation and animal groups to promote better wildlife management policy. They always bring ethics into the discussion. Not that ethics will be determinative all the time, but it's always an element that needs to be discussed.
Yeah, very, I agree with that. Very well stated. Would you agree that the biggest moral assumption responsible for the defeat of Proposition 127 is the belief in human supremacy over all other forms of life?
That's an interesting question. I think, one, it's an empirical question, and I don't know. But two, I also think as an empirical question, there could be many nuances to the answers that we'd find. So, yes, it's likely there's a lot of people who have either latent or manifest beliefs of anthropocentrism, dominionism, human exceptionalism, human supremacy, speciesism. They all mean slightly different things, but they're all in the general ballpark. But it also may be, especially because, as Becky Nemick's research revealed, it was liberals' trust in expertise that they think the experts may be doing right by the wildlife, by the cougars, and by the bobcats. I don't know that for a fact. It's an empirical question, but I think when we think about it analytically, I think we have to be open to those options and those possibilities. One, so as not to denounce others who may think differently than we did or voted wrong from, one perspective or another, but also to recognize that ethical thinking is very complex and very nuanced, and you need to pay attention to these nuances to really understand it.
I wish we had time to go into moral foundation theory, but we simply don't have the time to do it. I found it very interesting, and I know what you're referring to. From your writings, I believe you regard the belief in human supremacy as the root cause of the biodiversity crisis and global warming. Is that true?
I would say that it's a root cause. So I don't think it's the only root to our troubled relationship with animals and nature, much less our troubled relationship with ourselves. But I think it is a taproot, if I could put it like that.
Okay. You describe your work as ethical capacity building. What led you to believe that ethics, not science or politics alone, was the missing piece in environmental decision-making?
I think two things. One was the example of, through the writings of Arnie Nace and Mary Midgley. Arnie Nace's concept of deep and shallow ecology, sort of bringing out the ethical, cultural, philosophical dimensions of ecology, and Mary Midgley's work, which is you can describe as very anti-reductionist. She doesn't want to reduce things down. If things are complex, that's okay that they're complex. We're capable of thinking through that complexity. Let's get on with it. Those two influences had a big impact. Donald Worster's book, Nature's Economy, which I read in the 1985 edition, that also had a huge impact on me because it I was reading this as a grad student in geography, which is the elder tradition of environmental studies, and it showed that ecology has always had a science side and an ethics side, always. And those sides have been mutually informing to one another. And while there have been attempts on the science side to get rid of the ethics, that's never succeeded. The ethics has always won through. So, for example, the notion of the ecosystem was invented by Arthur Tansley in the 1930s to try and get away from community ecology. Why? Because Tansley wanted to reduce ecology down to some kind of quantitative, positivistic science. And community ecology was looking at relationships, but it also was drawing lessons from the animal world and the ecological relationships back to society. And being a believer in scientism, that a sort of strict notion of science was the only and best form of knowledge, Tansley wanted to get rid of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I really like that you have developed a 5-part strategy for social change. The 5 stages or principles of your theory of social change end in a reinstitutionalization of society, which is definitely a long-term project. Do you also have a short-term or emergency strategy for the environmental crisis immediately before us?
That's another good question, another really good question. So when you're talking about the theory of change, if I'm remembering the website correctly, you're speaking about politics and ethics writ large, moral values drive public policy, et cetera.
As the first principle. And then you, I really like that, by the way. My background is philosophy, so anything about Plato and Aristotle is fascinating to me. But I ask you this other question because we don't really have time to go into the 5 stages.
I think it's, but to answer your question, the more direct activity is our ethical capacity building, where we help people envision. Well, we train them about ethics, right? And we train them how ethics intersects with science and public policy. But all of that is about helping them envision and frame public policy in the short run so that they can talk about the ethics of, let's say, a bill like Proposition 128, and think about that pro or con, however they're going to think about it, but that it's available, the ethics of it is available for them to think about it. The ethics is manifest, it's not latent, it's not hidden in the public policy itself. Also, our education, the research, the education, the outreach are things we do in particular with our fellows. We're in the fellows are already well educated, but they're helping produce more education themselves. But we also are involved in practical workshops that help train them, and then placing them in positions of moral responsibility so that they can have a positive effect on the well-being of animals and the rest of nature.
Well, following up on that, how do you weigh short-term priorities against long-term transformation? To me, it's a difficult balance.
It is for us too. I don't want to speak for everybody. I'll speak for me. It is for me too. And I think you do it through a situated moral understanding, a recognition that ethics is best when it's not applied top-down, but it's really engaged in a conversation with the empirical realities of the world, and you're taking account of the context as you find it. You also have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. You have to be able to be engaged in the short-term activities, such as I'm involved with some of the the ongoing discussions, both legal and otherwise, about the barred owl massacre that the federal government has started to engage in, supposedly for the benefit of spotted owls. But then you also have to think long term. At the same time, challenging human supremacy might be a good example of that. Helping people understand that many animals are not just creatures with intrinsic value, they're non-human persons who are so very much like us. We have direct duties to them right now that we should be acting on.
Yeah.
So thinking short-term, long-term, I just think is the part of the process of being a human being, thinking about public policy over time. You've got to do both.
Right. Okay. Well, I should mention that the questions on intrinsic value are eventually coming up. So,
okay, that sounds good.
Staying on the topic of tragedy, how important do you regard things like letters to the editor, comments to agency people, pressuring politicians?
I think it's always essential, and I understand people's frustration because the political system, the agency system has been set up to ignore people's beliefs, people's desires, people's interests. So I can't remember the name of the study right now, but for 20 years we've known there's 0% relationship to the public policies people want overall in the United States and the public policies that get delivered through Congress. Mm-hmm. 0% relationship.
Yes.
And that's true in the states as well. Mm-hmm. And this is very true with respect to wildlife policy. There's overwhelming public support for the protection of wildlife, for the ending of trophy hunting and other activities like that. And yet that never gets undertaken or seriously considered because of the political structure of state level and national level wildlife agencies.
Mm-hmm. What about lawsuits?
It's important. It's important for people to push back.
Okay.
It's important for people to continue to be involved, but it's also important for them to be involved in the social change, changing the literal structures of government that allow their voices to be heard and acted upon. So once again, it's long-term, short-term. You've got to do both. The concern is if you say, throw up your hands and don't do anything, don't say anything, silence implies consent. And you can never allow consent to become the default when wrongdoing is occurring. Mm-hmm. All it takes for wrong to triumph is for good people to do nothing, right? Mm-hmm. But at the same time, when you're banging your head against the brick wall, you've got to start dismantling that brick wall. And that involves a lot of political change and a lot of political activity at different levels of governance.
So regarding lawsuits and protests, pretty much what you
I'm
just
strongly
said.
in favor of them. I'm strongly in favor of them.
Okay.
But I'll say this, I don't think there's substitutes for thinking about the ethics. Mm-hmm. They complement the ethical piece. I say this because there are organizations like the Center for Biological Diversity that literally do not take account of the ethical dimensions of these issues. Mm-hmm. They think about them entirely as scientific and legal issues.
Yes, I agree with you.
And they could, it wouldn't take very much for them to expand their ambit a bit. Mm-hmm. And it would be much more effective, I would think. Their politics would be much more effective if they did. But, there's a kind of mindset in environmental and animal circles that goes back to the sorts of grassroots campaigns and lawsuits that arose in the 60s and 70s and were very successful at that time.
Yes. Yeah,
but there
I entirely
hasn't been the
agree
adaptation.
With you.
Yeah, there hasn't been that adaptation.
Right. So say what you will about Karl Marx. I think he was right. that without an
Okay.
awareness of an alternative economic system to endless profit seeking, we will never achieve qualitative change, no matter how bad things get. Your response?
Most people would have a hissy fit hearing the words Karl Marx.
I
Because
know
what
that.
immediately comes to mind is the command and control economies of the old Soviet Union and the political pogroms and oppression of Maoist China, or we could say Xi's China, and Soviet Russia of the day. But as it turns out, most people want public policies that are rooted in the perspective of democratic socialism, the perspective of Bernie Sanders. They want childcare. They want universal health care, and so on. All of these are democratic socialist perspectives. My grandmother happened to be one of the founding charter members of the Democratic Socialists in Canada. Back then, it was called the Cooperative Confederation. She represented a style of socialism that most Americans would be very, very comfortable with. That's why it was called cooperativism, not communism. So it really took the role of individuals seriously, freedom seriously, free markets seriously, property ownership seriously, but still saw society as having an ethical obligation to the well-being of all its citizens and the importance of society taking on certain roles that individual citizens could not. Exactly what Abraham Lincoln believed the federal government was for, to do for individuals what they cannot do for themselves, I think is the exact quote. So I think you're right on the money, but there is a huge ideological barrier to get through. But I want to say something else about this. While I've been very critical, maybe haven't been as directly critical as I might be in other circumstances, but I'm very critical of the far right of this country and the direction it's taken the nation. I'm equally critical of the far left, and especially Marxism, because in the economic and political manuscripts, where Marx talks a lot about the analogy between human beings and beaver, he states a phrase that becomes the basis of what's called the metabolization thesis, that nature is man's inorganic body, and then afterwards, I'm paraphrasing, to be metabolized for our purposes. It's a straight out perspective of human dominion. And as articulated today in the academy through discourses of what's called political ecology or convivial conservation, etc., it is just as dominionist over animals and the rest of nature as a strictly capitalist way of thinking about these issues are. And I think from my part, it's probably important to move away from Marx and start lifting up people like Edward Bernstein, who was Marx's student, who left Marxism because he was concerned about its violence and its failure to grapple with the power of deliberative democracy, and founded what was ethical socialism, which became the basis of modern-day democratic socialism. And of course, those countries that follow democratic socialism are the wealthiest, happiest, most stable, least class-ridden societies in the world. We're talking about the Norwegian, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Canada. It's those nations that have the highest quality of life, far higher quality of life than we have here in the United States. So yes, you're on the money there.
Okay. Well, we don't have time to go into a debate about Marxism. I just would point out to you that in the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, that statement that you cited, you will find it there, but you will also find other statements in the manuscripts that support the liberation of nature as an ally in the liberation of human beings. And there's even talk in there about nature as a subject in its own right, and this sort of thing. So anyhow, I just put that in there, and let me go on to the next question.
Well, let me say, let's have another show sometime and talk about this stuff.
Okay, I'd love to.
Yeah.
How do you respond to those who argue that focusing on social justice and equality issues should take precedence over striving for a global community that cares for animals?
There's two ways to talk about this, I think. One is to say that they're one and the same thing, that the animal community is part of a larger social justice community. And many people do think about it like that. And there's lots of benefit and good insights in thinking that way. Yet, I think what that imposes is a notion that animals are differently developed human beings, and our ethics should not take account of the differences in animals or the very big differences of ecological communities and ecological systems. Those differences from individuals. So I don't find it entirely persuasive in that way. So to give you a concrete, I find most people concerned with animal rights and veganism as an ethical stance to be adopting a kind of political liberalism or political libertarianism with respect to animals. And it misses out the community of life, the more communitarian sense that the ecosystems and that community of life bring to the table that have to be thought about. Thus, you get things like wild animal welfare, which often wants to get rid of predators because predators are doing something wrong by engaging in carnivory, as opposed to recognizing predation as an important value that's part of a larger community of life, which our community of life could not survive without, and should be valued as such. I won't go into too much about the arrogance of thinking that we could take predation and predators and turn them into vegetarians, herbivores. So I think something gets missed when we think about it simply as a social movement and not as an ecological movement in that way. Mm-hmm. The other thing I think that happens is that the social takes the social as the human social takes primacy over animals and the rest of nature. This is something you see in political ecology from the left and new conservation from the right. And I think both are wrong in that regard because they're denying the important intrinsic value of animals in nature.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you see, I'm shifting gears here.
Okay.
Do you see AI, artificial intelligence, as a powerful tool that can serve the common good if it is subordinated to ethical values?
Oh, my goodness.
That's a big question.
That's a tough one because a part of me, I'm a technophile. I use AI every single day. Mm-hmm. I'm familiar with its benefits. At the same time, I recognize intellectually the problems that AI challenges in terms of disengaging people from learning, dumbing them down. But more importantly, there's the external costs of AI: water, land, energy, pollution, a resource sink when we have so many other needs. So I think, yes, it can be a boon to humanity, and we could make it a boon to animals and nature, but it has to be subordinated under strict ethical, with strict ethical and scientific scrutiny.
Okay. Do you think that anthropocentrism is a part of human nature?
I've thought about that a lot, and I don't know how to answer that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because I'm not trying to avoid the question. I think it's so complex.
Mm-hmm.
We're moral primates, in the language of Mary
Mm-hmm.
Mitchell. Perhaps our singular excellence as other animals on the planet is not just that we can relate to other animals and each other ethically, to care about each other and other animals, but it's that we can abstract that from our personal relationships into philosophies and public policies to make that care manifest over space and time.
Yeah.
And
well, you anticipated that was going to be my next comment about us being the moral primate. And I guess my question would be, if there is a tendency, at least in human nature, towards anthropocentrism, and also we are the moral primate, wouldn't that mean that there's a contradiction in human nature?
I think, what is it that Isaiah Berlin talks about humans as a twisted timber of humanity?
Yeah.
From nothing is made straight from us. This is where notions, I think, of good and evil come out of, because we are mixtures. We're very flawed creatures in that particular sense. And good and evil are early way of framing that. Mm-hmm. And I also think that we're all, beyond being moral primates, we're also political primates, mm-hmm. in groups, out groups. And we can see from very constricted worldviews in terms of our group or our needs versus their group and their needs. So yes, I think we have lots of conflicts as mm-hmm. part of human nature. Mm-hmm. And the point is not to deny them or come up with a philosophy that pretends it's otherwise, but to grapple with them straight up.
Mm-hmm. As I read your work, you seem to have great confidence in the human capacity to rise above human-centeredness and adopt an mm-hmm. ethical standpoint. I agree mm-hmm. that human beings have this freedom, but the historical record for our species for at least several millennia is evidence against our willingness to exercise this unique power. What makes you mm-hmm. think that humans can and will change course?
Moral progress. Mm-hmm. Dale Jamieson has a good book on this, and I believe it's entitled Moral Progress. I believe in moral progress, not that it's just possible, but it has occurred. When you think about, despite all our problems, all the pushback, the changes we've made around race, class, gender, ethnicity, age, ability, all those social dimensions of justice and ethics, we've made real strides. And I, too, think that we've made real strides with respect to animals and nature. They may be threatened, and I think that's a large piece of that has to do with the political structures of the new right that we've been talking about before. But I think we've made moral progress there. Mm-hmm. And I believe that moral progress can continue. Mm-hmm. So that's why I feel confident. That's why I manifest confidence in that. Mm-hmm. Partly, it's also dispositional. I'm an optimistic person. Mm-hmm. I'm not a pessimistic person. And maybe that is clouding my judgment to a degree. I certainly am brought up short at times because, for example, I never thought when I started working, when I wrote my first article about wolves, that I would reach the end points of my life and wolves would still be struggling for recovery in North America. I really believed that we would have achieved full recovery by this point. I was wrong about that. So sometimes this positive disposition and this belief in moral progress, the rug gets pulled out from under that.
Yeah. Well, I have two related questions on this, so let's stay with this for a moment here. Question one: when you consider the sixth extinction, global warming, collapsing ecosystems all over the world, do you agree that there is a realistic possibility that we may not make it as a species? Or do you think this is doomsday talk that only makes things worse?
I don't think it's either. I don't think it's foretold that we'll die out as a species. I think for many of us, those in the lower classes, the middle classes, life will be near apocalyptic. The rich will insulate themselves. But I don't think people are being doomsayers when they say it could get that bad. Mm-hmm. I think there's a course in between. Could we go extinct? Sure. I lived through, I became politically active during the days of rage of the nuclear freeze movement. This is back in the 80s when I was an undergraduate. And we came very close to thermonuclear war, which probably would have driven humans to extinction. And we're starting to make those same mistakes again, especially in Europe, because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the lessons people are taking from that, that the only thing you can do to protect yourself from larger bullies is nuclear weapons. Europe's looking at that option with respect to the United States right now because of its predatory policies with respect to the EU. So I'm very worried about that, along with climate change, biodiversity collapse, social and economic inequality, et cetera. Very worried about those issues.
Okay, so second question. Would you be surprised to learn that there are a lot of people that I have run into in the environmental community who are misanthropes or haters of humankind because of what we have done to the earth? And they say they would not mind it at all if people died off. Have you run into this?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I think sometimes it's dark humor. But there are misanthropes. There's no doubt about that. But there's misanthropes everywhere. It's not just environments or animal folks. There's misanthropes everywhere who, anyone who has a cause and sees the harm that humans do in the world can grow to hate humans. I'm not one of those people, partly because I think it's self-destructive. That's not the right word I'm looking for. It's ineffective. And it doesn't actually help create the change and provide betterment. But I think it's partly my optimistic character as well. I like people. Even people I disagree with vehemently. I often find those people very likable, very smart, very warm, very caring, and then we'll hit a cliff where we just don't see eye to eye at all. But from that, I take hope that a fusion of horizons of understanding is possible over time. Not in my life, but over time.
Okay. I'm going to shift gears again and ask you the following question. Have you given any thought to how much of the Earth's surface needs to be wilderness to sustain the well-being of wild animals?
Well, the answer to that is pretty clear. It's the 50% solution. It's half Earth. Now, of course, we used to call this the 50% solution in graduate school before the term half Earth was coined.
Right.
And this was partly because was it Reednoth and Coppner? I can't remember his co-author's name. Wrote a book entitled Nature's Legacy, I think, and it estimated you needed between 30 and 70% of the world in wildness to preserve its biodiversity. So I think as a scientific matter, you need about, 50% is a round number, right? You need about 50% there. I think as a moral claim, it's also correct. We're one species. We're a distinctive species. We can do distinctive good. We can do distinctive harm. There's no sense in thinking, and I also think it would be unethical in thinking about getting rid of us, but making a good faith effort to leave half the earth for the rest of life, the community of life, while inhabiting the other half ourselves. That makes a lot of sense to me.
I like that.
How that's done, though, has to be thought about in both ecological and social ways. I'm not for throwing people under the bus and just moving them off of the landscape and saying, now it's going to be wild. I think you have to recognize people's connections to place. You have to allow time for change to occur. You have to optimize that change. So some places are wild. Some places are going to be highly developed. Bill Borey, who's an expert on wilderness and who's part of PanWorks, he likes to talk about wildness as untrodden, not untrod, meaning that we can have direct connections with wildness, but it's the question, degree and scale and harms of our impacts that really, really matters. And then, of course, the ability of a community of life to thrive.
I like the idea of bringing morality into the determination.
Mm-hmm.
So now we come to intrinsic value.
Sure.
When I interviewed Kirk Robinson, who is the founder of the Western Wildlife Conservancy, he said that the primary value of wilderness is for the sake of sentient creatures. Would you agree with this?
No, I wouldn't.
Why not?
And the reason why is because I don't want to put words in Kirk's mouth, and we've talked about this before, but Kirk is a sentientist. He believes that sentient animals are the center, the loci, the focus of moral value in the world. That includes us. That includes other creatures like us, and creatures down to ants, termites, and others that might have, our ability, have an ability to experience, feel pleasure or pain, etc. I think that is too restrictive for a variety of reasons, and I think it also it attempts to be a substitute for the concept of intrinsic value. And I understand why he wants to do that, because he believes intrinsic value is some kind of immaterial property that exists out there that gives creatures their value, instead of the creatures' house properties themselves, like sentience, sapience, sociality, for which by which they have value. It's a way of interpreting the world and the values that are going on in the world.
Okay,
I disagree with him because...
Let me follow up on this issue with a very basic question. It's a question I ask everyone I interview. I know it's difficult, but I would ask you to try to put in a few simple words, why wilderness?
It's the place of origin, it's the place of restoration, and it's the place of wild beasts.
If there are planets without life, Is there anything morally wrong with exploiting their minerals and other resources for the sake of life on Earth?
Yes.
And why is that?
Well, one is there's a certain arrogance of assuming that we understand life as it might be on another planet. And there's also the abuse of resources for, let me say this, the use of resources for abusive human ends. I think if you had simply a corporate form of human governance that simply sought to enrich the elites by raping other planets of their resources, irrespective of the life they might have or the life they might develop, I think that's really problematic. But of course, it depends on context. There are asteroids in the asteroid belt between the Earth and Mars that would provide all the mineral wealth we could hope for hundreds of years here on Earth, because they're big chunks of metal with lots and lots of resources there. Would I necessarily oppose mining those? No. I think all the time, though, these questions need to be subject to moral scrutiny and moral judgment about when it's right or wrong. Now, it takes us back to the question of intrinsic value. For me, intrinsic value is not some material substance. It's properties about beings or things that are intrinsic to them that you can't think clearly about ethics without taking account of that. Sentience, sapience, sociality are good examples of what that is with respect to human beings. Evolution, speciation are two kinds of predation, are three kinds of values that are essential to understand the natural world around us and the ability of nature to support our lives. And like Arnie Nace and Mary Midgley, I don't believe there is a division between me as a person and an organism and the rest of nature. But there's also, I'm an embodied creature who's embedded in a natural world. Arnie Nace would say there's nested layers of self-realization connected to that I am me, I'm a separate person, but I'm also connected to a larger ecological and social community, which I need to sustain my life. And so myself, in some senses, extends out from my plain body and can be seen as tightly connected to the social groups, the ecological situations in which I exist. Those questions would arise on other planets. But of course, you have to think about the context. You can't just say all planets have intrinsic value and therefore they can't be touched. Or what kinds of intrinsic values are there? Might we be able to inhabit this planet without destroying its flora and its fauna and come to a kind of multi-species relationship that's salubrious for both humans as interstellar beings and those interstellar bodies with their life forms as well? All of that is going to depend on context, but it always should be subjected to a sophisticated, situated moral understanding.
Thank you. So we have about 13 minutes left, which is going to bring us up to 2 hours. So I have a few more questions, a couple of experiences I want to get your response to. When I was a boy, around 10, I was given a Davy Crockett knife and hatchet set, and I soon went into the woods behind our house and cut down a few mid-sized trees. When I looked back on what I had done, I felt ashamed and guilty. I don't believe anyone taught me this was wrong, nor that anyone ever told me not to do it. I wonder how such experiences fit into your understanding of environmental ethics?
Mm. It raises the question of culpability and responsibility. There are many people who want to say, and we have this debate in PanWorks itself, that if you're at all part of a system that exploits animals and nature, that you're culpable for that. I think that's wrong. Culpability implies intentional wrongdoing. And that's its legal definition, and I think it's also its best ethical definition. But just because you're not culpable, because you didn't intentionally decide to do something wrong, does not mean you're not responsible for it or responsible for doing something about it. You don't have to feel guilty and shame for cutting down those trees. Although I have experiences that are similar. But what that experience reflects and tells you is there's a moral question about how we relate to animals and the rest of nature. Our moral responsibilities to trees themselves, to the ecological community of which they're a part. How we think about living beings who are not even animals, but still are living beings on part of what is still a wondrous planet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Those sorts of things you were experiencing are real and important. When I think about this, I hear from many people and they feel guilty and shame and they frame it about culpability. And I think responsibility is a better way to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the experience number 2, when I was collecting signatures to stop the trophy hunting of mountain lions, some people, mostly women, would say, "Give me that clipboard," without any prompting or explanation from you. What do these immediate gut from me? I mean, in other words, I didn't need to provide any information or arguments to you. What do these immediate gut responses tell us about developing an environmental ethic in the general population?
It means we need to pay attention to the relationship between ethical reasoning and ethical feeling, because the two are not divorced. They're connected with one another. Again, Mary Midgley's integrated self. And emotions signal something is going on. Right or wrong, good or bad, they're a signal to pay attention, perhaps to do something. Now, Augustine and Aristotle and others would say the trick is making sure that your reason and your emotions are aligned together properly so that your emotions can lead you astray. They can lead your reason astray. Or you can ignore your emotions and rationalize your way out of something. I don't want to pretend that can't happen and that's not a problem. But I think honoring the emotional responses that people have to something that they have thought about or feel about ahead of time. And so when you approach them with that clipboard and say, this is against trophy hunting of cougars, bingo, they say, that's right.
Exactly. So do you think that environmental ethics are learned through moral intuitions? Have you thought about where these intuitions come from?
Mm-hmm. I'm not an intuitionist in the classical sense that these things just happen and you just know the truth for what it is. I think what we call intuitions is often our reflective equilibrium, to put it in the language of Tom Reagan? Or is this connection between our emotions and our reasoning? And our emotions are saying, this feels right or this feels wrong, and that comes, we frame that as an intuition. So I think those are absolutely real. But I think the experiences that we have with others are real. So, for example, I know many ranchers who would say that wolves are just varmints, vermin, and villains. They never thought about them as anything but a problem on their land. But then you start to talk to them about how they feel about their cows. They care about their cows. They know their cows as individuals often. They name their cows. They have working dogs they deeply, deeply care about, who are not just working animals, but they're also companion animals. And when you ask them about that and then start to reflect on wolves as being creatures who also have manifest sentient, sapient sociality like their cows, or much less their working dogs that are basically domesticated wolves, that opens up possibilities for moral reflection that they perhaps hadn't thought about before. So there's this experiential learning dimension that goes along with it. But partly it's also education and framing. Mm-hmm. What they hear on the news, what they hear out of the church pew or out of religious radio, etc. The conversations that they have in the bar with people. All of those places are sources for moral learning and moral insight.
Mm-hmm. So we're down to the last two questions, and this is question 61, so congratulations.
I can't believe we've gotten through 60 questions.
I appreciate you're hanging in there.
Sure.
So much of the field of environmental ethics focuses on individual moral obligations towards animals or nature. Do you think the field gives enough attention to the social and political structures that shape our ability and willingness to act morally?
Not at all. Mm-hmm. And that's a major failing of both environmental ethics and animal ethics, is both thinking about these questions as if it's just about individual questions of responsibility, and not more collective deliberation and decision making. So you're absolutely right on that path. And you see this. So, for example, let me give you a very concrete, interesting example. Compassionate conservation in some arenas is framed as a virtue ethic. Why is it framed as a virtue ethics? Because some environmental philosophers said environmental ethics is about the environment, it's not about animals. So therefore, it either has to be consequentialist or deontological. If it's about animals and it must be deontological, that really doesn't. The animals don't fit, so you have to move over to a virtue ethics. So it's still about people and their responses to animals in nature, but it's about people's virtues. It's not about the animals themselves.
Mm-hmm. Have you imagined what a society that fully integrates ethics, ecology, and social justice would look like? Or at least have you had some ideas about what it would look like?
Yes, it would look like Mary Midgley's mixed community, where we have both social and ecological obligations to people, animals, and nature alike. That will mean vast changes in terms of how our society is organized today. I think we have a lot to learn in this respect from First Nations and from alternative visions of alternative communities in Western society today.
And finally, what core idea or ethic would you like our listeners to take away from this interview?
Situated moral understanding, that you've got to situate your ethics in specific contexts and take the context as they are. Not pretend that there's a universal answer that you can just slap down everywhere as if it's going to tell you what's right or wrong all the time, but really seek out context to understand the moral issues at play and to give you guidance about what to do with them.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I will be in touch with you about a possible conversation on Karl Marx.
That sounds wonderful. This has been a delightful conversation. Thank you for taking all this time to chat with me.
Well, thank you. It was really, it helped me to develop in terms of the field of environmental ethics by reading and rereading your essays. So thanks a lot.
All right. We'll talk soon then.
All
Bye-bye.
right. Bye-bye. You've been listening to Wild Earth Conversations with my guest, Bill Lynn, on KWSI 100.3 radio in Grand Junction, Colorado. More conversations in this series are available at kwsiradio.org or on KWSI's YouTube channel. If you have comments or questions about the show, or if you would like to be a guest, then send me an email, wildearthconversations@kwsiradio.org. Please include a phone number.